They called me a freeloader right in the stone-tiled kitchen I had renovated for my grandmother. My parents demanded I sign away the last clean family asset to save their golden child from financial ruin. My father sneered that I could never afford a decent BMW. Exactly 10 minutes later, a black BMW rolled up the driveway. The woman who stepped out carried documents powerful enough to completely crush their pathetic illusion of wealth. I am Lillian Watson, and for my entire adult life, I have been the invisible stain on my family's impeccably tailored upholstery. To exist as the eldest daughter in a household that worships the religion of visible, ostentatious wealth is to live under a perpetual, unforgiving microscope. Every choice I made was a rebellion against their grand design. They looked at my plain gray cashmere sweaters, my bare fingernails, and my quiet, remote working schedule, and they saw a profound tragedy. To them, a woman who did not loudly broadcast her income to every passing stranger was a woman who simply had no income at all. I was the child who went nowhere, the quiet disappointment who preferred the soft, steady glow of a laptop screen in a quiet, dimly lit room to the dazzling, artificial lights of a charity gala or a country club fundraiser. I did not drive a leased luxury vehicle. I took trains. I wore sensible shoes. I was, in their eyes, a complete failure of the Watson legacy. My parents, Douglas and Elaine Watson, were master architects of an elaborate, fragile illusion. They lived entirely for the hollow prestige of their affluent Charlotte suburb, a place where perfectly manicured, emerald green lawns hid heavily maxed out credit cards, and the neighborhood association functioned like a ruthless shadow government. My father, Douglas, was a man who measured another human being's soul strictly by the make of their imported wristwatch and the bespoke cut of their golf trousers. He spoke loudly in restaurants and always parked terribly, assuming the world would simply make room for him. My mother, Elaine, judged the success of her entire existence based on what the neighbors could see from the sidewalk on a Sunday afternoon. She was a woman of tight smiles and tighter budgets, shuffling money between hidden accounts just to ensure her seasonal floral arrangements outshone the woman next door. They desperately needed their lives to look like a curated spread in a glossy lifestyle magazine, and my steadfast refusal to play the role of the glamorous, vapid socialite was a daily, personal insult to their life's work. Then there was Connor. Connor Watson was the undeniable golden child, the blinding sun around which my parents' manicured, anxious universe revolved. He was the founder, president, and highly visible face of Crown Axis Motor Group, a luxury auto brokerage that dealt exclusively in imported sports cars and oversized, aggressive sport utility vehicles for men desperate to outrun their midlife crises. Connor spoke fluently in the exhausting language of hustle culture and venture capital, though his actual capital was always mysteriously tied up in the next big deal, the next quarter, the next phantom investor. Beside him stood his wife, Paige Holloway-Watson. Paige did not have a career. She had a highly produced personal brand. Her entire existence was a relentless, exhausting stream of luxury lifestyle posts, documented meticulously across every available social media platform. Every overpriced dinner out, every newly leased vehicle parked in a VIP lot, every designer handbag casually draped over a velvet chair was photographed with the aggressive precision of a military campaign. They were the perfect, shiny, plastic couple, dripping in European labels, constantly performing their wealth for an invisible, judgmental audience of thousands. But the true center of gravity in our family, the only thing of actual, undeniable substance, was not their sprawling suburban house with its imported marble foyer, nor was it Connor's flashy glass-walled showroom downtown. It was Harbor Row Storage and Garage. It was a decidedly unglamorous, gritty piece of commercial real estate consisting of 12 weather-beaten cinder-block storage bays and a modest automotive repair garage tucked away near the industrial, unsavory side of the harbor. My grandmother, Eleanor, left it entirely to my management when she passed away 5 years ago. She did not leave it to my father, her own flesh and blood, nor to Connor, her supposedly brilliant entrepreneurial grandson. She left the trust to me because, as she whispered to me during her final, lucid days in the hospice ward. I was the only one in the family who knew the difference between a solid foundation and a crumbling facade. Harbor Row was not pretty. It smelled of old motor oil, damp cardboard, and salt air, but it generated a steady, unshakable, recession-proof stream of revenue every single month. It was the absolute last clean, debt-free asset left in the Watson bloodline, guarded fiercely by the only daughter who did not care about looking rich. The trap was carefully set on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. My phone vibrated across my desk with a frantic, breathy call from my mother. Her voice trembled violently as she declared a massive family emergency, demanding I drop everything and come to the house immediately. My mind raced through the terrible, standard possibilities. I genuinely thought my father had suffered a massive heart attack on the tennis court, or perhaps there was some catastrophic, melodramatic issue regarding the upcoming Easter holiday arrangements that only I could mediate. Yet, even as I requested a rideshare and watched the digital car inch closer on my screen, a cold, heavy intuition settled deep in my stomach. Something felt deeply, structurally wrong. Families like mine do not have sudden emergencies in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon unless the emergency directly threatens their social standing or their bank accounts. When I finally stepped through the heavy, oversized mahogany front door and walked into the sprawling, stone-tiled kitchen, the air was thick enough to choke on. This was the very kitchen I had personally paid out of pocket to renovate for my grandmother nearly a decade ago, back when this house still felt like a home. Now there was no warm, inviting smell of roasting meat or simmering garlic, no sign that a comforting family dinner was actually taking place to soothe this so-called emergency. Instead, the massive granite kitchen island looked exactly like a staging ground for a hostile corporate takeover. The drinks had already been poured. A heavy crystal glass of single malt scotch sat untouched next to my father's tightly gripped, white-knuckled hand. A goblet of buttery Chardonnay sweated near my mother. Connor and Paige were not dressed for a panicked family gathering. They were dressed as if they were about to pitch a tech startup to a room full of ruthless, wealthy investors. Connor wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit that screamed custom fit, and Paige was tightly wrapped in a beige cashmere midi dress that likely cost more than the average person made in an entire month of hard labor. The atmosphere in the room was suffused with an unnatural, suffocating tension that made my skin prickle. Connor absolutely could not stand still. He kept pacing the length of the marble counter, his expensive leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone, his eyes darting down to his smartphone every 10 or 15 seconds. He muttered something under his breath to Paige about waiting to hear back from a lender, his thumb swiping aggressively, almost desperately, across the glowing screen. But it was my father who truly gave the horrific game away. Douglas Watson was a man who usually projected a lazy, entitled, impenetrable calm. Tonight, he was actively sweating. A thin, undeniable sheen of moisture coated his forehead, and his jaw was locked so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He snapped viciously at my mother when she simply offered him a linen cocktail napkin. He looked exactly like a man who had already pushed a massive boulder off a steep cliff and was now desperately, hopelessly trying to outrun the inevitable, crushing crash. He avoided looking into my eyes completely, staring instead at a fixed spot on the expensive wallpaper. "Sit down, Lillian," my mother finally said, her voice tightly strained, gesturing weakly to the heavy oak dining table situated just adjacent to the open kitchen. I walked over slowly, the dead, heavy silence in the room pressing painfully against my eardrums. I pulled out the high-backed leather chair and took my seat at the head of the table. I looked down, expecting to see a porcelain dinner plate, or perhaps at least a woven placemat waiting for a meal. Instead, resting precisely dead center in front of my chair, was a thick, heavy cream-colored manila legal folder. The edges of the countless documents inside were perfectly, sharply aligned. The brass clasp at the top was securely fastened, trapping whatever secrets lay within. It did not look like an emergency medical report. It did not look like hospital admission papers or a funeral home brochure. It looked exactly like a pre-written, binding sentence, waiting only for a compliant executioner to sign it. I stared at the blank cover of the file, the truth washing over me like ice water. The family emergency was not a medical tragedy. The family emergency was me. My father did not waste time offering me a drink or asking about my day. He simply picked up the thick manila folder from the center of the table and slid it violently across the polished oak surface. It stopped mere inches from my chest. "Open it," Douglas commanded. His voice held no warmth, only the tight, impatient snap of a man accustomed to blind obedience. "It is a formal termination of use notice, along with an amendment to the management proxy for Harbor Row. I have already had my people draft the transfer of authority. All we need is your signature on the final page. I expect you to do it right now." I looked down at the crisp white pages peeking out from the folder, then back up to his flushed face. I did not reach for the pen he was holding out to me. Douglas scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Do not sit there and give me that blank stare. Lillian, you have lived off the family assets long enough. You have coasted by while the rest of us actually work to maintain the lifestyle and reputation of this name. It is time you stopped being a freeloader and actually contributed to the survival of the people who raised you." My mother stepped into the silence immediately, a perfectly synchronized partner in their lifelong routine of emotional attrition. She took a delicate, measured sip of her Chardonnay, her eyes turning cold and hard over the crystal rim. "Your father is absolutely right," Elaine said, her tone dripping with a terrible, polite condescension. "You sit glued to your laptop in your grandmother's old, drafty garage all day, and you genuinely think that constitutes a serious, respectable career. It is embarrassing to explain to my friends. When they ask what my eldest daughter does, I have to make up excuses. Meanwhile, your brother is out there in the real world, building a tangible, highly lucrative future for this entire family." At the mention of his own perceived greatness, Connor stopped pacing the kitchen tiles. He moved toward the dining table, resting his hands casually on the back of an empty chair. He was trying to project the relaxed, invincible aura of a master negotiator, but I could see the frantic pulse beating rapidly in his neck. "Look, Lillian," Connor started, deploying the persuasive, overly familiar tone he undoubtedly used to trap wealthy clients into terrible lease agreements. "Crown Axis Motor Group is on the absolute verge of a massive, unprecedented expansion. We are talking about locking down the exclusive regional franchise rights for 3 major European luxury imports. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to dominate the high-end market in this state." He paused, waiting for me to look impressed. When I offered nothing, his smile tightened into a grimace. "But commercial lenders are tight right now," he continued, speaking faster, the desperation leaking through his polished veneer. "They want proof of liquidity. They require a short-term collateral bridge to underwrite the expansion capital. It is just a minor, temporary formality. 90 days, maximum, probably closer to 60. If we pledge the deed to Harbor Row as the backing asset, they release the funds tomorrow morning. This family steps into an entirely new, untouchable tier of wealth. We all win. You get to be part of something huge instead of just managing a dusty lot." Paige let out a sharp, breathy laugh that grated against my ears. She picked up her heavy designer handbag from the counter, intentionally moving it into my direct line of sight, making sure the iconic gold hardware caught the light of the chandelier. "Honestly, Lillian, you act so incredibly superior," Paige chimed in, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. "You live your entire life hiding in a literal storage facility, dressed like you are going to a community center meeting, and you still look down your nose at us. It is quite pathetic, really. Connor is out here breaking his back to elevate the Watson legacy, and you are just hoarding a miserable pile of bricks because you are too terrified to take a real, adult risk. You would rather drag us down than see Connor succeed." I let their insults hang in the suffocating air. I looked at each of them. I saw my father's raging entitlement, my mother's bitter vanity, my brother's sweaty desperation, and his wife's hollow arrogance. They were a symphony of greed. completely blind to their own impending ruin. I kept my hands folded softly in my lap. I did not touch the folder. "I am not signing anything," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria they were desperately trying to provoke. Harbor Row is not a dead asset. Connor, it generates a solid, reliable, and completely debt-free cash flow every single month. It is not a disposable bargaining chip for a highly speculative, over-leveraged car loan. I shifted my gaze directly to my father, refusing to blink. Grandmother left the management trust entirely in my care for one very specific reason. She knew exactly what would happen if any of you ever gained control over it. She saw your boundless greed and your absolute financial incompetence years before this supposed franchise deal ever existed. She knew you would drain it dry to fund your illusions. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The fragile veneer of upper-class civility shattered completely. Douglas slammed his open palm against the heavy oak table with such terrifying force that my mother's wineglass tipped over, spilling a puddle of pale yellow liquid across the polished wood. His face twisted into a mask of dark, dangerous fury. "You ungrateful, miserable wretch!" he roared, leaning over the table, his face mere inches from mine. "I put a roof over your head. I paid for your existence. And the very first time your family asks for a simple, temporary measure of support, you hoard a useless, ugly piece of dirt like a paranoid miser. If you do not pick up that pen and sign that legal document right this second, you can walk out that front door and never, ever step foot on this property again. You are dead to me." Elaine did not flinch at his violent outburst. She calmly dabbed at the spilled wine with a linen napkin, her expression completely detached from the cruelty of the moment. She looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "You are not the master of this house, Lillian," my mother said, her voice dropping to a chilling, razor-sharp whisper. "You never were. You are just a burden. You are nothing but a freeloader taking up space in a world you do not belong in." There was nothing left to debate. The verdict had been delivered, the familial bonds permanently severed by their own hands. I felt a strange, profound sense of liberation wash over my chest. They had finally said the quiet parts out loud. I stood up slowly, pushing the heavy leather chair back across the stone floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer them a single tear. I simply turned my back on the four of them and began walking steadily down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the heavy mahogany front door. My father's bitter, mocking laughter chased me down the corridor, echoing off the high ceilings. "Yes, run away," Douglas shouted after me, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Go stand on the corner and wait for the public train like a commoner, or maybe you can beg for a cheap rideshare from a stranger. A woman like you, with your small, pathetic life, will never understand what it is like to even sit inside a decent BMW." I reached the entryway and wrapped my hand around the cold brass handle of the front door. Just as I pulled it open, preparing to step out into the cool evening air, a brilliant, blinding flash of white light cut violently across the manicured front lawn. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of expensive tires rolling over the decorative driveway gravel broke the hostile quiet of the affluent neighborhood. Two piercing LED headlights swept directly across the large dining room windows, illuminating my family in a harsh, unforgiving glare. A long, pristine, jet black rolled slowly and deliberately up the driveway. It moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a shark gliding through dark water, coming to a smooth, silent stop exactly at the base of our front steps. The screaming match inside the house died instantly. The mocking laughter evaporated from my father's throat. A heavy, stone-like silence fell over the dining room as they all stared through the glass at the luxury vehicle idling in their driveway. It shattered the moment Connor threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. The sound was harsh and entirely devoid of genuine amusement. He pointed a manicured finger toward the window, his chest heaving as he manufactured a look of absolute pity. "Oh my God," Connor wheezed. wiping a dramatic tear from the corner of his eye. "You actually rented a luxury car. You hired a driver to pull up exactly when you planned your grand exit. Tell me you did not spend your last $500 on a black car service just to try and intimidate us." "This is beyond pathetic." Paige immediately joined in, her high-pitched giggle echoing off the stone walls. She leaned against the kitchen counter and shook her head slowly. "I cannot believe you just blew your entire savings account on a stunt," Paige said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Did you really think rolling up in a rented sedan would suddenly make you look like a peer? You still look like you buy your clothes in bulk. A temporary ride does not change who you actually are." I did not turn back to look at them. I kept my hand on the cold brass handle and pulled the heavy door open. The person who stepped out of the rear passenger seat was not a hired chauffeur coming to collect a fare. Her name was Caroline Mercer. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that radiated authority, her posture razor straight and her expression entirely unreadable. Her heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the stone walkway, carrying a weight of purpose that immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the foyer. Tucked securely under her left arm was a thick leather briefcase. Caroline was the chief legal counsel for Meridian Ledger Group, a woman whose entire professional existence was built on dismantling fraudulent enterprises and destroying the people who ran them. She moved past me into the house without waiting for an invitation, her cold gaze sweeping over the 4 people frozen in the kitchen like a predator assessing a very weak herd. My father blinked rapidly, his previous rage momentarily derailed by the sudden intrusion of a stranger who clearly did not belong in his carefully controlled environment. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim the physical space Caroline had instantly dominated. "And who exactly is this?" Douglas demanded, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. He looked Caroline up and down, curling his lip into a sneer. "Is this some discount hourly lawyer you found on the internet? Did you seriously bring a strip mall attorney into my home to try and scare me out of a basic real estate transfer?" I closed the front door quietly behind Caroline and walked back into the dining room. I did not take my seat. I stood beside the table, completely grounded, feeling the power dynamic in the room shift violently under their feet. "I did not hire her by the hour," I said, my voice maintaining a low, steady cadence that contrasted sharply with my father's shouting. "Caroline is here at my direct and urgent request. There are specific physical documents that needed to be placed into your hands tonight, securely and on the record, before this situation passes a point where it can no longer be legally contained." Connor scoffed loudly, slamming his hand against the marble island. The frantic energy had returned to his eyes, but now it was mixed with a creeping, undeniable paranoia. "Legally contained?" Connor mocked, stepping forward. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to? I run a multi-million-dollar automotive brokerage. I move inventory that costs more than you will make in your entire miserable lifetime. You cannot touch me. A woman who works remote from a dusty storage unit does not get to walk into this house and threaten a legitimate enterprise." I looked at my brother, taking in the expensive suit, the flush skin, and the desperate, hollow bravado. It was time to pull away the curtain. "I do not work remote from a storage unit, Connor," I stated clearly, letting each word land heavily in the quiet room. "I never have. I use Harbor Row as a secure, private address. For the past 7 years, I have been the sole founder and managing director of Meridian Ledger Group." I paused, allowing the name to hang in the air, watching their faces contort in confusion. "We do not sell things," I continued, my tone completely clinical. "We audit them. Meridian specializes in complex asset fraud investigation, severe bad debt restructuring, and the forensic tracking of corporate financial misconduct. We are the firm that commercial lenders hire when they suspect a borrower is lying to them. We tear apart shell companies, trace shadow accounts, and build the legal frameworks required to seize assets from people who operate entirely on fraudulent leverage." For exactly 3 seconds, total paralysis gripped my parents. My mother's hand hovered motionless over her wine glass. My father's jaw went completely slack, They stared at me as if I had just spoken a language they could not comprehend. The daughter they had dismissed as a failure was calmly describing a corporate reality that dwarfed their suburban ambitions. But the human capacity for denial is a remarkably stubborn thing. The paralysis broke, replaced immediately by aggressive, desperate rationalization. Elaine let out a sharp, breathless laugh, waving her hand dismissively through the air. "Oh, please," my mother scoffed, looking at Douglas for validation. "Meridian Ledger Group. It is just a fancy name. Anybody can register an online corporation for $50 and call themselves a managing director. She is probably just doing basic bookkeeping for small businesses and trying to make it sound like Wall Street." Douglas nodded quickly, seizing the lifeline my mother had thrown him. "Exactly. Do not let her play these ridiculous mind games. She is bluffing. She is trying to confuse the issue so she does not have to sign the property over." Connor crossed his arms defensively, a smug, self-satisfied smirk creeping back onto his face. He shook his head slowly, looking at me with pure condescension. "If you were actually rich," Connor argued, his voice dripping with absolute certainty, "if you actually owned a firm that tracked millions of dollars, you would not be wearing a sweater that looks like it came from a discount rack. You would not take the public train. You would not live like a ghost. People with real money do not hide it. They show it. You are lying. Lillian, you are just a sad, jealous woman trying to ruin my success because you have none of your own." They had perfectly built their own mental prison, convinced that wealth only existed if it was shiny, loud, and constantly validated by strangers. They could not fathom a world where power operated silently in the background. I did not argue with them. I did not try to convince them of my net worth or the square footage of my corporate office. Arguing was for equals, and we were no longer equals. I simply turned my head slightly and nodded to Caroline. Caroline Mercer had not spoken a single word since stepping through the front door. She did not need to. She stepped forward smoothly, moving right past my glaring father, and approached the heavy oak dining table. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, firmly bound dossier. She placed it precisely dead center on the table, right next to the amateur, desperate proxy amendment my father had tried to force upon me. Unlike my father's folder, this dossier bore a heavily embossed, unmistakable seal on the cover. It was the official, registered watermark of Pine and Vale Commercial Bank, the exact lending institution Connor had been frantically waiting to hear from all afternoon. The dull thud of the heavy dossier hitting the wood echoed through the room like a gavel striking a block. Caroline took one step back, clasping her hands loosely in front of her. The quiet, terrifying reality of the Pine and Vale seal stared up at my family, signaling the absolute end of their delusions. The family meeting was officially over. The dismantling of Connor's fake empire had just begun. Caroline Mercer did not wait for my family to recover from their shock. She operated with the ruthless, mechanical efficiency of a surgeon opening a chest cavity. Her fingers unclasped the heavy brass bindings of the Pine and Vale Commercial Bank dossier, and she began laying out crisp, densely printed financial spreadsheets across the polished oak table. Directly over the spilled wine and the useless proxy documents my father had tried to force upon me. "Your entire business model is a meticulously curated fiction. Connor," I began, my voice perfectly level, stripping away the last remnants of his golden boy persona. "Crown Axis Motor Group does not generate actual, sustainable profit. You do not possess a luxury auto empire. You operate a highly leveraged, incredibly fragile illusion. Your entire daily operation is sustained entirely by floating customer cash deposits, aggressively maxing out revolving credit lines, and projecting a manufactured image of immense wealth on the internet just to attract the next round of unsuspecting victims to keep the lights on." Connor stood frozen at the edge of the kitchen, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his pale face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Let us look at the primary asset column," I said, gesturing toward the first set of documents Caroline had arranged. "This is the most recent floor plan audit conducted by your primary lenders, in a legitimate dealership, This document lists the vehicles physically sitting on your lot, which the bank has financed for you. But a massive portion of your documented showroom inventory is completely phantom. Our analysts discovered that over 60% of the vehicles listed on this sheet simply do not exist in your possession. They are ghost cars. Some of them are vehicles you already sold to retail buyers weeks ago. Yet you deliberately failed to pay off the bank lien, pocketing the cash instead. Others are vehicles that exist only on paper, fabricated entirely to artificially inflate your borrowing base and secure higher credit limits from institutions that foolishly trusted your reported metrics. I paused, letting the sheer scale of the fraud settle over the room. My mother, Elaine, was staring at the spreadsheets as if they were written in an alien dialect, her mind fiercely rejecting the mathematics of her son's ruin. But you did not stop at simple phantom inventory, I continued, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction as I exposed the deepest layers of his incompetence. You became incredibly sloppy, Connor. You believed you were smarter than the regulatory systems. You took a single imported sports car, a highly specific performance model, and you utilized it as the primary collateral to secure 4 entirely separate short-term bridge loans from 4 different mid-tier lenders within a span of 6 months. You manipulated the vehicle identification numbers on the digital applications, subtly altering a single digit here and there. You changed the purported acquisition dates, and you deliberately bounced the title liability between 3 different limited liability shell companies you recently registered in Delaware. You engineered a scenario where 4 separate banks currently believe they hold the exclusive, senior lien on the exact same piece of metal. That is not aggressive business scaling. That is textbook, undeniable wire fraud. Connor's chest was heaving. He gripped the edge of the marble island so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. Before he could formulate a lie, I shifted my focus to the woman standing paralyzed beside him. And then there is you. Paige, I said. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with a sudden, visceral terror. You love to play the role of the oblivious, pampered wife who simply enjoys the fruits of her husband's labor. But the paper trail dictates a very different reality. You are not a passive beneficiary. You are a registered corporate principal in this scheme. Caroline moved smoothly, sliding a secondary stack of highlighted bank statements down the table toward Paige's expensive designer handbag. 8 months ago, you registered a corporate entity named Velour House Media, I stated clearly, watching the color drain entirely from Paige's heavily contoured face. You listed yourself as the sole managing director. On paper, it is a boutique marketing and public relations agency. In reality, it is nothing more than a crude financial funnel. Every single month, Crown Axis Motor Group authorizes massive, 6-figure advertising budgets payable directly to Velour House, but those corporate funds never purchase legitimate media buys. They never secure billboard space or digital ad campaigns. I tapped my index finger against the top page of the ledger. I have the complete, forensic reconciliation right here. It provides a devastatingly clear picture. A client wires a $75,000 cash deposit to Crown Axis on a Monday morning to secure a custom vehicle allocation. 48 hours later, Crown Axis issues an $80,000 outgoing wire to Velour House Media, categorized vaguely as brand consultation fees. 24 hours after that, Velour House initiates a series of direct transfers to pay off your Platinum personal credit cards. We track the stolen customer deposits flowing directly into your private country club dues, your rented weekend luxury cabins, your personal photographer fees for your social media content, your imported designer goods, and your premium golf course memberships. Every single stolen dollar bleeds right into the exact same sinkhole. Paige physically recoiled, pressing her back against the kitchen cabinets as if the documents on the table were emitting heat. She looked frantically at Connor, but he offered her no protection. He was entirely consumed by his own collapsing reality. "You have absolutely no idea how this industry functions," Connor suddenly erupted, his voice cracking with a high, panicked pitch. He pushed away from the counter, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are looking at numbers on a page without understanding the context. That is standard, flexible capital structuring for a hyper-growth enterprise. The entire luxury sector operates on market confidence and deal velocity. You have to project overwhelming strength to secure the best vehicle allocations from the manufacturers. Money has to move fast. It is called liquidity bridging. You are taking a temporary snapshot of our cash flow and calling it a crime because you do not have the basic business acumen to understand the mechanics of scaling a multi-million-dollar brokerage. He was sweating profusely now, entirely abandoning the sophisticated persona he had worn when I first walked through the door. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I kept my tone glacial, cutting through his desperate corporate buzzwords with absolute precision. Every failing executive in the world loves to talk about deal flow and capital agility. When the audit walls finally start closing in on them, I replied, staring directly into his panicked eyes. But let me make this incredibly clear to you, Connor. There is not a single legitimate, legally compliant industry on the face of this earth where you use the cash deposit from a new customer this month to extinguish the burning liquidity fire you started with a different customer last month. You are not bridging capital. You are operating a retail Ponzi scheme wrapped in leather interiors. And as of this afternoon, it has entirely collapsed. The room descended into a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by Connor's ragged breathing. My mother had covered her mouth with both hands, staring blindly at the floor. My father, Douglas, had not spoken a word since Caroline placed the bank dossier on the table. He was staring at the documents with a dark, terrifying intensity, his mind undoubtedly racing to find a loophole, a way to isolate himself from the blast radius of his son's criminal negligence. I turned my attention entirely to him, preparing to deliver the final, fatal blow of the evening. But the most fascinating document in this entire portfolio, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. I nodded to Caroline. She reached into the very back of the leather briefcase, extracted a single, heavily redacted sheet of paper, and placed it directly in front of my father's empty chair. It is not Connor's forged inventory list. It is an internal, highly confidential collateral proposal submitted directly to the Senior Loan Committee at Pine and Vale Commercial Bank. Douglas looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his breath hitch in his throat as the reality of his own exposure locked into place. Look at the date stamped at the top right corner. Father, I instructed him coldly. That specific proposal, the one explicitly listing the deed to Harbor Row Storage and Garage as the primary backing asset to absorb Connor's catastrophic bad debt, was formally submitted to the bank exactly 3 weeks ago. I let the heavy, toxic silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring every single person in the room absorbed the magnitude of his betrayal. You did not call this family meeting today because of a sudden, unforeseen financial emergency, I said, my voice finally carrying the bitter weight of my realization. You have been actively, secretly negotiating with commercial lenders to steal my property behind my back for 21 days. You sat there tonight, sipping your scotch, calling me a freeloader, all while knowing you had already offered up my inheritance to save your own fragile reputation. Elaine's posture became impossibly rigid, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the edge of the heavy oak table. She lifted her chin, desperately attempting to summon the haughty, impenetrable grace she usually reserved for charity galas and exclusive neighborhood association meetings. You are intentionally making this sound like some sort of elaborate criminal enterprise. Lillian, my mother said, her voice shaking only slightly, though her eyes betrayed a deep, creeping terror. It is absolutely nothing of the sort. We are simply providing temporary support to your brother. That is what a good, loyal family does when one of their own is aggressively expanding a legitimate, highly profitable business. We bridge the financial gaps. We help manage the temporary growing pains. It is a standard, completely normal family investment. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, a woman whose entire identity was meticulously stitched together by country club gossip and perceived social superiority. The betrayal I felt in that moment was not a sudden, sharp stab of pain. It was a slow, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, a realization of just how little they valued the truth when it conflicted with their vanity. I nodded to Caroline. My counsel reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a slender blue folder, extracting a crisp stack of banking statements. She did not slide them across the table. She handed them directly to me. I held the papers up so my mother could see her own forged signature of denial, reflected in the harsh, unforgiving dining room light. "This is not an investment, Mother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the room with the devastating impact of a physical blow. "An investment yields a tangible return. What you did was an act of desperate, blind panic. 2 months ago, you quietly initiated a series of massive wire transfers from your primary retirement portfolio. You liquidated almost the entire balance. Over $450,000, completely wiped out in a matter of 14 days. Elaine's breath hitched violently in her throat. Her hand flew to her chest, her carefully constructed mask of suburban perfection shattering into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. "You did not give that money to Connor to buy new luxury inventory," I continued, forcing her to look directly at the undeniable proof of her own financial ruin. "You wired those funds directly to a third-party escrow account to blindly settle massive credit card chargebacks and refund angry retail clients. These were people who had paid Connor cash deposits for custom vehicles 3 months prior. Vehicles that were never delivered because they never actually existed. You drained your entire life savings just to keep the local authorities from walking into his showroom with handcuffs. You paid off his victims so your friends at the golf course would not find out your golden boy is a catastrophic fraud." "Shut your mouth right now, Lillian!" Douglas suddenly bellowed, his face turning an alarming mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged aggressively against his expensive silk collar. He could no longer hide behind his heavy Scotch glass or his arrogant sneer. The reality of their shared financial suicide was finally caving in on him, stripping away his patriarchal authority. "You do not understand the immense pressures we are under. Connor promised us the capital from the new regional franchise rights would hit the accounts by next Friday. It was a guaranteed closing. I only took out the home equity line of credit to float the temporary margin call. We just needed 1 more week." The entire room went completely, terrifyingly still. Even Connor turned to stare at our father in absolute, unadulterated horror. Douglas had just confessed to the one cardinal sin he had desperately tried to keep buried beneath his loud, commanding facade. I felt a cold, sharp laugh rising in the back of my throat, but I swallowed it down, keeping my expression entirely clinical. "A home equity line of credit," I repeated slowly, letting the devastating reality of those words settle over the polished wood of the table. "You took out a secondary mortgage on this house, the house you have spent 30 years bragging about to strangers. You leveraged the very roof over your head, borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars against your primary residence, to feed a black hole that your son dug with his own unearned arrogance. And now the money is gone. The franchise deal never existed, and the bank is going to take this house." The sheer gravity of their collective delusion was breathtaking. They had willingly cannibalized their own future, destroying decades of wealth simply to protect a lie built on imported leather and fake social media posts. Seeing the absolute, undeniable destruction of his parents' financial security laid bare. Connor abruptly changed his tactics. The arrogant, untouchable luxury broker vanished entirely into thin air. In his place stood a desperate, cornered child. He stepped away from the kitchen island, his hands raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender, his voice dropping to a pleading, sickening whine. "Lillian, please," Connor begged. Taking a slow, cautious step toward me, he looked exactly like a drowning man reaching blindly for a piece of floating driftwood. "You are right, okay? You are completely right about the numbers. Things got out of hand. I overextended the corporate accounts trying to grow too fast. But we can fix this right now. Tonight, you do not even have to give up Harbor Row. If Meridian Ledger Group is as powerful as you say it is, and if you truly have the capital you are demonstrating, all you have to do is sign a primary personal guarantee on the bridge loan. Just back my credit with your corporate portfolio. The lenders will immediately back off. We keep everything completely quiet. No one in the neighborhood ever has to know a thing. We can save the family name. Before the absolute absurdity of his request could fully register in the silent room, Paige stepped forward. The sneering, contemptuous woman who had just mocked my plain clothing and my quiet lifestyle was suddenly radiating a sickly, manufactured warmth. She reached out, her heavily manicured fingers hovering just inches from my arm, her eyes wide with fake, desperate sincerity. "Connor is right. Lillian," Paige pleaded, her voice trembling with highly practiced, theatrical emotion. "Family is family. At the end of the day, blood is the only thing that truly matters in this world. We might have our disagreements, we might say things we do not mean, but we have to protect each other from the outside world. An educated, highly successful woman like you surely understands the absolute value of protecting your own relatives from public destruction. We need you. We are begging you to help us." I stood motionless, looking at the four people arranged before me in the dim, expensive light of the dining room. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick with their suffocating desperation. My mind replayed the events of the last 15 minutes with crystal clarity. Less than a quarter of an hour ago, I was standing in this exact spot, being aggressively and cruelly branded as a freeloader. I was a parasite, a failure, a miserable wretch who was entirely unworthy of sitting in their elevated presence. They had aggressively demanded I surrender the only clean asset left in my grandmother's name, threatening to permanently exile me from the family if I refused to bow to their will. They had mocked my clothes, my transportation, and my entire existence. But the absolute second they realized I held the keys to a fortified financial empire, the exact moment they understood I possessed the power and the capital they had foolishly squandered, their entire reality shifted on its axis. I was no longer the invisible disappointment. I was suddenly their savior, their personal fire extinguisher, the bottomless wallet they felt entirely entitled to drain to save their own skin. It was the most deeply disgusting, profoundly revealing metamorphosis I had ever witnessed. They did not love me. They did not respect me. They only respected the financial leverage I suddenly held over their miserable, collapsing lives. "No," I said. The word was quiet, flat, and absolute. It dropped onto the table like a heavy block of lead, crushing the last remaining breath of hope in the room. Connor's pleading expression instantly curdled back into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What do you mean, no? I am your brother. You have the money. You have the corporate backing to stop this. You can make this entire nightmare go away with one single signature." I looked him dead in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment from the man standing across from me. "I am not refusing simply because I despise what you have become, Connor," I explained, my voice carrying the steady, unyielding authority of a judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. "Though I absolutely do despise it, I am refusing because I actually understand the law. If I sign a personal guarantee on your highly fraudulent debt structure, I am legally co-signing your endless list of crimes. I would be formally binding my clean assets, my legitimate corporation, and my own freedom to your stolen customer deposits and your forged vehicle titles. I am not going to federal prison just so you can keep driving a leased sports car and Mother can keep showing her face at the country club." I looked at my parents, their faces pale and sunken, instantly aged by a decade of stress in a single evening. They had built their entire lives on a fragile foundation of sand, and now the inevitable tide had finally arrived to wash it all away. A short, sharp sound escaped my lips. It was a laugh. It was not a laugh of joy, nor was it a laugh of triumphant victory. It was a cold, hollow, metallic sound that echoed harshly against the stone floor and the high ceiling of the kitchen I had once renovated with love. It was the sound of a heavy rusted iron chain finally snapping in half. The laugh hit them harder than any of the devastating financial documents Caroline had produced. It made my father physically flinch. It made my mother shrink back deep into her heavy leather chair. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sheer coldness of the sound. Because in that single, freezing note of laughter, they heard the one devastating truth they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. They finally realized that the desperate, quiet girl who had always hovered on the edges of their lives, silently hoping for a single ounce of their genuine affection, was completely and permanently dead. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer feared their vicious rejection. And I certainly did not care if their entire fake empire burned to the ground with them inside it. The sound of my cold laughter died abruptly against the heavy, expensive velvet drapes of the dining room, leaving a vacuum of sound so profound I could distinctly hear the low mechanical hum of the central air conditioning unit. My parents and my brother stared at me, stripped entirely of their usual psychological weaponry. They had aggressively expected tears. They had expected quiet, submissive compliance. They absolutely did not expect to be entirely outmatched by the daughter they had spent a lifetime ignoring. I did not give them a single moment to catch their breath or formulate a new lie. They foolishly thought I was finished simply because I had dropped a few sheets of paper on the table. They vastly underestimated the terrifying depth of a fully funded corporate forensic audit. I gave Caroline a brief, almost imperceptible nod. She did not reach into her briefcase for another paper folder. Instead, she retrieved a sleek, flat black tablet, followed by a remarkably small, high-definition portable projector. With practiced silent efficiency, she set the heavy metal device squarely on the edge of the granite kitchen island and pointed its high-powered lens directly toward the expansive, blank beige wall of the formal dining room. The wall instantly transformed into a massive, glowing canvas of financial ruin. The sudden stark shift in light cast harsh, dramatic shadows across Connor's pale, sweating face. It was no longer a conversation around a dinner table. It was a live autopsy of a fake empire, broadcast at 80 inches wide. "Let us look at the actual anatomy of your business expenses," I said, my voice steady, projecting effortlessly over the quiet, electronic hum of the machine. Caroline tapped the glass screen of her tablet. A massive, complex financial flowchart materialized on the wall. It was color-coded and bright, aggressive hues that made my mother physically wince and look away. Thick red digital lines connected the main corporate operating account of Crown Axis Motor Group directly to the shell entity of Velour House Media. "You aggressively claimed this was a necessary marketing budget," I continued, stepping slightly to the side so Paige had a completely unobstructed view of her own digital footprint. "But the ledger tells a wonderfully detailed, highly incriminating story. 3 weeks ago, an exact transfer of $47,000 moved directly from a client vehicle escrow account into Velour House. Less than 48 hours later, that exact same amount was dispersed into 3 distinct personal channels." Another tap on the glass. The screen quickly zoomed in on the outgoing transactions, magnifying the numbers until they were impossible to ignore. $12,000 to completely clear the past due balance on a Platinum Rewards credit card, I read aloud, tracing the projected red line with my eyes. $8,000 for a 4-day weekend rental at an exclusive mountain cabin retreat, and a remarkably precise charge of $27,000 paid directly to a premium cosmetic dermatology clinic located in South Park. Not a single one of those expenditures bought a billboard. They bought your cheekbones. Paige, they bought your luxury vacations. They funded the entire fake illusion you parade around online every single day. Paige let out a choked, strangled noise, her heavily manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. The glowing numbers painted on the wall were completely irrefutable, starkly illuminating the exact, stolen cost of her vanity. But I was not done. I did not give them the luxury of time to process the first blow before delivering the second. However, Paige's superficial spending is merely a symptom of the rot, I said, shifting my cold gaze directly back to my brother. The actual disease requires a much larger, much quieter financial drain. Caroline smoothly swiped her index finger across the tablet, The screen dissolved instantly and reformed into a stark split view. On the left side was a scanned commercial lease agreement. On the right side was a meticulously reconstructed timeline of Connor's digital professional calendar. This is a 36-month residential lease for a luxury penthouse apartment in uptown Charlotte, I explained, the cool blue light of the projector reflecting sharply in my eyes. It features floor-to-ceiling windows, private secure elevator access, and a monthly rent of $9,500. It is officially registered to a blind trust, but the guarantor signature firmly belongs to Connor Watson. The rent is automatically deducted from a secondary, heavily concealed operating account tied directly to Crown Axis. Connor took a sudden, staggering step backward, his shoulders hitting heavily against the wooden frame of the hallway door. His breathing became rapid and shallow. He knew exactly what was illuminating the wall. Now, let us cross-reference the keycard access logs for that specific penthouse building with your professional calendar, I said smoothly. I had absolutely no desire to turn this evening into a cheap, screaming melodrama about marital infidelity. The emotional mess of his private life was entirely irrelevant to me. I only cared about the pure, unadulterated leverage the data provided. Bright yellow lines of data began to connect across the projected screen, linking dates and times with brutal precision. On the 14th of last month, you explicitly told your wife you had a critical lender dinner spanning from 6 o'clock in the evening until nearly midnight, I noted, reading the synchronized data aloud for the entire room to hear. The building security system logged your personal keycard swiping into the penthouse lobby at exactly 6:15. You did not leave the building until the next morning. On the 22nd, you claimed you were touring a secondary showroom facility in a neighboring city. The garage cameras at the uptown building recorded your luxury SUV pulling into a reserved residence space at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I turned to look at Paige. Her eyes were completely dilated, staring at the timestamps as if they were written in a terrifying alien language. I am not here to dissect your broken marriage, I told her, my tone completely devoid of even a fraction of sympathy. I am simply demonstrating that your husband is not a stressed entrepreneur fighting tooth and nail to save this family's financial future. He is actively siphoning stolen client deposits to fund a completely parallel, hidden life behind your back. The reaction I logically expected from Paige was a complete emotional collapse, perhaps a tearful, violent confrontation directed at the man who had so thoroughly deceived her. Instead, the intense psychological pressure shattered her reasoning entirely. She could not process the horrific fact that her entire curated reality was a lie, so she fiercely and blindly attacked the person holding the mirror. Paige lunged forward, her hands curled into tight fists, her face contorted with an ugly, visceral hatred that ruined her expensive makeup. "You absolute psychopath!" Paige screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking violently and echoing off the high stone ceilings. "You have been stalking us. You hired private investigators to follow my husband. You illegally hacked into our personal accounts just so you could stand there and try to destroy my marriage. You are just a bitter, jealous, lonely woman who cannot stand to see anyone else living a happy life." She was hyperventilating, entirely ignoring the massive federal financial crimes projected on the wall, choosing instead to focus all her blinding rage on the messenger. It was a pathetic, highly predictable display of a woman whose only actual currency was her public image. Before I could even bother to respond to her hysterical outburst, my father stepped heavily into the center of the room. Douglas Watson had been uncharacteristically silent for the last 5 minutes. The humiliating revelation of the home equity loan had momentarily crushed his spirit, but as he watched the digital presentation, a dark, twisted sense of survival had apparently taken deep root in his mind. He straightened his back, adjusting the stiff cuffs of his expensive shirt. The panic that had previously choked him was suddenly replaced by a sickening, highly triumphant smirk. He looked at the glowing wall, then looked directly at me. He actually chuckled, a dry, raspy sound of pure, arrogant defiance. "That is a very impressive presentation, Lillian," Douglas said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. acting exactly as if he were evaluating a junior employee's failed corporate pitch. Very colorful, very detailed. It makes for excellent, highly dramatic theater. But it is completely useless. He walked slowly toward the dining table, resting his heavy hands firmly on the edge, leaning forward with the absolute confidence of a man who firmly believed he held an unbeatable hand of cards. You honestly think you have backed us into a corner because you found a few secret bank accounts and an apartment lease? My father sneered, his dark eyes locking onto mine. You think you can just walk in here, act like a corporate titan, and dictate the terms of our absolute surrender, but you are too late. You are incredibly, foolishly late. I remained perfectly still, my face a mask of stone, quietly waiting for him to step completely into the steel trap he had so arrogantly set for himself. That collateral proposal you showed me earlier? Douglas continued, his smile widening into a terrifying, predatory grin. The one from 3 weeks ago? That was not just a draft proposal. It was a finalized, fully binding agreement. When you refused to sign the proxy transfer earlier this evening, you honestly thought you were protecting the property. But I did not actually need your signature today. I only wanted it to make the paperwork look slightly cleaner for the internal bank auditors. He paused, deeply savoring his perceived victory, desperate to violently reclaim his position as the absolute patriarchal authority in the room. I already signed a formal trust amendment 5 days ago, Douglas declared loudly, making absolutely sure every single person in the room heard his triumph. I executed a binding legal document that completely supersedes your grandmother's outdated wishes, legally elevating myself to the sole, undisputed managing trustee of Harbor Row. And I already used that exact authority to execute the final bridge loan contract. The ink is completely dry. The bank has already processed the pledge. Harbor Row is already fully collateralized. You have absolutely no legal power left to stop it. He looked at me with hungry eyes, expecting my cold exterior to finally shatter into a million pieces. He expected me to scream, to cry, to finally realize that my precious inheritance was already gone. He firmly believed that no matter how much dirt I had dug up on Connor, the central piece on the chessboard had already been violently taken from me. The silence in the room stretched out, thick, heavy, and suffocating. Connor let out a long, shaky breath of immense relief. Elaine closed her eyes tightly, clutching the delicate stem of her wineglass, as if it were a holy religious artifact. They honestly, truly thought they had won the war. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact with my father for a single second. I slowly raised my hand and gestured toward the woman in the charcoal suit standing quietly beside the projector. "Father," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper so incredibly cold it seemed to instantly lower the temperature in the entire house. "You just stood in the middle of this room and proudly confessed, out loud, directly in front of the chief legal counsel for an active financial investigation firm, that you unilaterally used a forged, legally void document to fraudulently mortgage a protected trust asset." Connor's smug facade completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, erratic man cornered by his own monumental stupidity. He stumbled backward away from the projected screen on the dining room wall, his hands frantically slapping at his expensive suit pockets until he retrieved his sleek mobile device. His fingers were trembling so violently, he almost dropped the phone onto the stone floor before aggressively jabbing at the glass screen. "I am calling the police," Connor announced, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. He pressed the device hard against his ear. "You are not going to come into this house and destroy my life with your fake spreadsheets. I am having you arrested for corporate espionage and extortion right now." He began pacing furiously across the length of the kitchen, his leather shoes slapping loudly against the floorboards. "Yes, 911, he barked into the receiver, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. "I need officers dispatched to my parents' residence immediately. My sister has violently broken into our home. She is actively attempting to extort me for millions of dollars. She hacked into my secure corporate servers, stole highly confidential client data, and is projecting completely forged banking records on the wall to threaten my family. My father and mother instantly recognized the tactical pivot and seized the opportunity with breathtaking speed. If they could not outsmart the financial audit, they would simply weaponize the local authorities to discredit the auditor. Douglas stepped close to Connor, raising his voice so the emergency dispatcher could hear him clearly over the open line. "Tell them she is deeply unstable," my father shouted, his face contorting into a mask of manufactured terror. "Tell them she has a documented history of severe psychological breakdowns. We are genuinely terrified for our physical safety. She is having a massive psychotic episode right in front of us." Elaine immediately chimed in, clutching her chest and utilizing her most fragile, trembling socialite voice. "Please hurry," my mother pleaded loudly toward the phone. "She is completely out of control. We do not know what she might do next. She is trying to ruin my son out of pure, unadulterated jealousy." It was a masterful, deeply sickening display of familial manipulation. They were desperately trying to paint me as a deranged, hysterical woman, relying on the classic, toxic trope of the unstable daughter to instantly invalidate every single piece of empirical evidence Caroline and I had just presented. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not move to snatch the phone from his sweating hand. I did not show a single fraction of the panic they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply reached out, pulled the heavy leather dining chair back out from the table, and sat down. I carefully reached across the polished oak, closed the thick leather cover of the Pine and Vale dossier, and neatly aligned its edges parallel to the table. "You should make sure you give the dispatcher the exact street address." "Connor," I said, my tone as casual as if I were reminding him to pick up dry cleaning. "Because that is quite literally the only intelligent, productive telephone call you have executed in the past 12 months. My absolute lack of resistance deeply unsettled them, but Connor was too far gone on his own adrenaline to recognize the warning signs. He ended the call, shoving the phone back into his pocket, a wet, triumphant sneer spreading across his pale face. "They are dispatching 2 patrol units right now," Connor spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. "You are going out of here in handcuffs. Lillian, you thought you were so incredibly brilliant with your little projector and your rent-a-lawyer, but you crossed the line into felony territory. By the time the local police are done tossing you in a holding cell, I will have my own attorneys bury your little bookkeeping firm so deep under defamation lawsuits you will not even be able to afford a bus ticket out of this city." We waited in the suffocating tension of the dining room. Paige had stopped screaming and was now huddled against the marble island, shooting venomous glares in my direction, clearly comforted by the thought of my impending arrest. My parents exchanged heavily relieved, self-congratulatory looks. They honestly believed the nightmare was over. They believed their wealth and their status in this upscale suburban neighborhood would automatically insulate them, and that the police would simply arrive, sweep the messy, inconvenient daughter out the door, and restore their perfect, fraudulent illusion. Exactly 7 minutes later, the wail of heavy sirens pierced the quiet evening air of the exclusive subdivision. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing sharply off the large brick facades of the surrounding mansions, until a chaotic flurry of flashing red and blue strobe lights violently illuminated the front lawn, casting frantic, moving shadows across the interior of our house. The heavy, grinding screech of large tires braking aggressively against the asphalt signaled their arrival. Connor actually smiled. It was a broad, deeply arrogant smile of absolute vindication. He practically sprinted toward the mahogany front door, throwing it open to welcome his supposed saviors, entirely ready to play the role of the wealthy, victimized executive. "Officers, thank God you are here," Connor started loudly, stepping out onto the porch. "The woman you need to arrest is right inside the dining room. She has been threatening us for the past hour." But the heavy footsteps marching up the concrete walkway did not belong to the neighborhood patrol division. They were not wearing standard blue uniforms, and they absolutely did not care about my brother's manufactured outrage. A man in a dark tactical windbreaker pushed straight past Connor without a single word of greeting. forcing my brother to stumble backward into the foyer. He was followed immediately by two women in sharp conservative business suits, and four more heavily armed tactical agents who quickly fanned out across the entryway, instantly securing the perimeter of the house. The man in the windbreaker held up a heavy gold shield, letting it catch the glare of the chandelier. The bold black lettering across the back of his jacket read, "Carolina Vehicle Commerce Unit." "Are you Connor Watson?" the lead agent demanded. His voice was not making a polite inquiry. It was a physical wall of authority that immediately crushed the remaining air out of the room. "Yes," Connor stammered, the arrogant smile instantly rotting right off his face. "But you do not understand. I am the one who called 911. My sister is the one who hacked my accounts." A tall woman in a dark gray suit stepped forward. Flanking the lead agent, she held a thick, brightly stamped legal clipboard. She was a senior investigator for the Interstate Financial Integrity Bureau. Behind her stood a man carrying a leather briefcase identical to Caroline's, a special assets representative dispatched directly from the Commercial Fraud Division of Pine and Vale Commercial Bank. "Connor Watson, I am executing a massive, multi-agency seizure warrant authorized by a federal magistrate 30 minutes ago," the female investigator announced, her voice echoing coldly through the house. "Effective immediately. You are completely locked out of all corporate and personal financial systems. We are seizing all electronic devices, hardware, and physical ledgers connected to Crown Axis Motor Group and Velour House Media. Furthermore, we are executing an immediate, forced physical repossession of all fraudulently collateralized luxury vehicles currently registered to your name, your shell companies, and this specific residential address." My father let out a choked gasp, falling backward into a chair as if he had been physically shot. Elaine covered her ears, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the destruction walking through her front door. "No!" Connor screamed, his voice breaking in absolute terror. He pointed desperately toward me, his hand shaking violently. "Look at the wall. Look at the projector. She is the one who forged all of this. She broke into my systems. Arrest her. You have to arrest her." The lead investigator from the Financial Integrity Bureau turned her head slowly and looked directly at me. She did not reach for her handcuffs. Instead, she offered a small, highly respectful nod of acknowledgement, a gesture between two professionals who had successfully coordinated a massive, complex operation. She turned her cold gaze back to my brother. "Meridian Ledger Group did not hack a single piece of your data, Mr. Watson," the investigator stated loudly, ensuring my parents heard every single devastating syllable. "Your sister's firm operates under a direct, heavily classified vendor authorization contract with the commercial lending sector. We explicitly provided Meridian with the master keys to your back-end financial ledgers because your primary bank flagged your accounts for catastrophic wire fraud over a month ago. She did not forge the evidence. She was legally hired to expose it, and her forensic audit is the sole reason my strike team is standing in your living room tonight." The absolute finality of the truth hit Connor with the force of a speeding freight train. The delusion completely shattered. There was no more running. There was no more fast-talking. There were no more bridge loans or fake marketing budgets to hide behind. Place all of your corporate communication devices, your secure building access cards, and every single set of vehicle keys currently in your possession directly onto that dining room table, the tactical agent ordered, stepping forward and resting his hand casually on his utility belt. Right now. Connor was entirely broken, the golden child, the supposed savior of the Watson legacy, moved with the slow, agonizing stiffness of a dead man. He reached into his tailored pockets with trembling hands. He pulled out his heavy gold keychain, a thick stack of plastic access cards, and two separate mobile phones. The heavy metal keys hit the polished oak table with a loud, incredibly satisfying clatter, landing right next to the damning financial dossiers Caroline and I had prepared. In the heavy silence of the house, another sound began to bleed through the open front door. It was the loud, distinct, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines, accompanied by the sharp, rhythmic beeping of commercial reverse alarms. I turned my head slightly to look out the large dining room window. Three massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks were aggressively backing up our pristine, manicured driveway, their bright amber utility lights flashing relentlessly in the dark. Paige finally broke. She collapsed onto the expensive stone floor of the kitchen, burying her face in her hands, her loud, racking sobs echoing off the cabinets. She was crying for the luxury vehicles being strapped down outside, for the penthouse apartment she would never see again, and for the total, irreversible evaporation of her fake, curated existence. Her desperate weeping blended perfectly with the mechanical grinding of the tow truck winches pulling the stolen luxury cars away into the night, creating the absolute perfect soundtrack for the end of their empire. The tactical team from the Financial Integrity Bureau began a methodical, highly coordinated sweep of the property. They moved through the sprawling, expensive home with clinical detachment, tagging luxury assets and boxing up digital hardware. The chaotic energy of the initial raid had slowly burned off, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of psychological trauma. The adrenaline that had fueled my family's arrogance had completely evaporated, violently replaced by the crushing, undeniable weight of their new reality. They were no longer untouchable suburban elites. They were suspects. Paige remained slumped against the base of the marble kitchen island, her designer dress pooling awkwardly around her knees. Her heavy diamond-encrusted smartphone vibrated incessantly against the stone counter. She stared blindly at the glowing screen. Automated alerts from elite financial institutions and premium credit card companies flashed in rapid succession, notifying her of immediate unilateral account freezes. The velvet ropes of her meticulously curated existence were snapping one by one, right before her eyes. The realization washed over her pale face. The high-end leasing company would inevitably demand the keys to her imported sports utility vehicle by Monday morning. The management firm overseeing the luxury uptown apartment would permanently sever access within 48 hours. She had absolutely no independent income, no marketable skills, and no remaining social currency. Her entire life was a leased illusion, and the repossession agents had finally arrived. My mother, Elaine, slowly lifted her head from her hands. Her meticulously styled hair was now frayed, her posture entirely defeated. The sheer magnitude of her financial destruction was settling deep into her bones. Her secure, heavily funded retirement portfolio was completely gone, vaporized to appease the angry victims of her son's reckless greed. Yet, instead of directing her profound devastation toward Connor, the son who had systematically robbed her blind, she turned her venomous gaze entirely upon me. She employed the twisted, deeply toxic logic of a woman desperate to preserve her own fragile sense of victimhood. "You knew," my mother whispered, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with bitter, misplaced resentment. "You sit there with your massive corporate firm, tracking his every single move, and you never gave your own family a single warning. You stood by and let me drain every last cent of my life savings. If you had simply spoken up 2 months ago, if you had just warned me, I could have saved my portfolio. You intentionally withheld the truth just to watch us be destroyed." It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. In her warped reality, the ultimate sin was not the fact that Connor had committed massive federal fraud, nor was it her own complicity in secretly paying off his victims to protect their country club reputation. Her greatest tragedy was that the whistleblower had not extended a professional courtesy to the accomplices. Douglas snorted, a harsh, abrasive sound that forcefully yanked the room's attention back to his fading patriarchal authority. He refused to issue an apology. He refused to acknowledge the towering inferno of his own financial ruin. He was a man who had spent 3 decades aggressively bending the world to his will, and he would absolutely cling to his delusions until the bitter end. Instead of accepting defeat, he violently pivoted. He began doing frantic, desperate mental math out loud, pacing a tight circle near the ruined dining table. "We can still salvage the primary estate," my father declared, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden buyers in the expensive wallpaper. "The commercial real estate market in the Harbor District is aggressively hot right now," If we formally list Harbor Row tomorrow morning and push for an expedited cash closing within 14 days, the capital will easily cover the massive home equity line of credit I initiated. We can satisfy the bank, quiet the federal investigators, and completely avoid the absolute humiliation of a public foreclosure. He paused, adjusting his collar, his expression hardening into pure, unadulterated malice as he looked directly at me. And frankly, Lillian, this entire catastrophe is completely your own doing, he spat, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. If you had not been so incredibly deceptive about your corporate success, if you had not hidden your wealth like a paranoid miser in a dusty garage, we never would have been forced to put our blind faith in your brother. We would not have needed to leverage this house. Your unnatural secrecy, your refusal to act like a proper member of this family, pushed us into a desperate corner. You made us trust him. It was a masterclass in narcissistic projection. He was actively blaming the daughter he had continually marginalized for the catastrophic failure of the son he had endlessly worshipped. I abandoned all attempts at engaging in a moral debate. Arguing ethics with a man drowning in his own ego is a profound waste of oxygen. I completely detached from the emotional wreckage of the room and seamlessly transitioned into the cold, unforgiving language of contractual law. Are you absolutely certain you wish to maintain that specific legal posture? Father, I asked, my voice devoid of any familial warmth, slicing cleanly through his frantic real estate calculations. Especially considering you are speaking directly in front of active federal agents, a special bank representative, and my chief legal counsel? Douglas froze, his brow furrowing in deep suspicion. What are you talking about? I am the sole managing trustee of Harbor Row. I have the signed paperwork. I offered a small, dismissive nod to Caroline. She reached into her briefcase one final time. She produced a single, sharply printed medical document, placing it neatly onto the table, directly beside his fraudulent trust amendment. My counsel has thoroughly reviewed the proxy document you submitted to Pine and Vale Commercial Bank, I explained, maintaining a perfectly level gaze. It is not merely a problematic contract. It is a fabricated, highly illegal piece of fiction. You explicitly dated your signature, and the supposedly authorizing signature of my grandmother, on the 17th of October. My father's face drained of all remaining color. His eyes locked onto the medical record, his breath catching painfully in his throat. On the 17th of October, I continued, letting the heavy words strike him like physical blows. Grandmother had just suffered a massive cardiac event. The Regional Memorial Hospital records clearly indicate she was heavily sedated and physically restrained in a medically induced coma. She lacked the basic motor functions to breathe independently, let alone review, comprehend, and execute a binding commercial property transfer. You forged her signature while she was fighting for her life. The silence that followed was absolute. The federal investigator standing near the hallway slowly crossed her arms, her eyes fixed sharply on my father. The bank representative quietly took a detailed note on his legal pad. Douglas had just been thoroughly boxed into a corner from which no amount of suburban charm or aggressive shouting could ever extract him. Yet, against all rational logic, he gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white. He still clung to a pathetic, microscopic shred of hope, fueled by decades of believing the rules did not apply to him. The commercial bank does not care about the origin of the signature, he rasped desperately, sweat beading on his forehead. They only care about liquid capital. They only care about balancing their ledgers. If I bring them a wealthy buyer for the lots, before the legal injunctions are formally filed in court, they will take the money and look the other way. I can still sell it. I can still fix this. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small, incredibly useless, and entirely unwelcome in my own family. I felt a profound, satisfying emptiness. There was no anger left. There was only the cold, mechanical reality of the trap closing shut. I stood up slowly, pushing the heavy leather chair back, and smoothed the fabric of my plain gray sweater. I did not look at him with hatred. I simply looked at him with pity. "The family meeting started with you kicking me out of my property," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy air of the ruined dining room. "It will end with the law deciding who really has to leave." Exactly 48 hours after the chaotic raid at the suburban estate, the heavy glass doors of my corner office swung open. The setting could not have been more drastically different from the claustrophobic, stone-tiled kitchen where they had tried to strip me of my dignity. Meridian Ledger Group occupied the entire 32nd floor of a premier glass and steel high-rise in the absolute center of downtown Charlotte. The panoramic windows offered an unobstructed, sweeping view of the financial district, a visual testament to the immense corporate architecture I had painstakingly built entirely without their knowledge or their money. My office was expansive, deliberately minimalist, and ruthlessly quiet. My father walked through the door. The visual transformation of Douglas Watson was completely staggering. The loud, arrogant patriarch who had confidently slammed a forged legal threat onto a dining table just 2 nights ago had entirely ceased to exist. In his place stood a hollowed-out, deeply exhausted old man. His custom-tailored suit, usually pressed to absolute perfection, hung loosely on his frame, deeply wrinkled as if he had slept in it. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, surrounded by dark, bruised circles of profound sleep deprivation. The dominant, booming voice he had weaponized my entire life was completely gone, replaced by a raspy, hesitant silence as he took in the sheer scale of my actual reality. He was finally standing inside my world, and it absolutely dwarfed him. Yet, despite the undeniable evidence of his complete defeat surrounding him, a deeply ingrained, toxic instinct still flickered in his eyes. He slowly approached the heavy mahogany desk, desperately hoping he could still manipulate the situation using the sheer, unearned gravity of blood ties. He collapsed heavily into one of the leather guest chairs facing my desk. He did not issue a greeting. He simply began reciting a bleak, pathetic inventory of their collective ruin, seeking a sympathy he absolutely did not deserve. He told me that my mother had experienced a complete nervous collapse the morning after the federal raid, refusing to leave her darkened bedroom as the neighborhood association began whispering about the tow trucks. Paige, stripping away the fake devotion as quickly as her credit lines were frozen, had packed 3 large designer suitcases and demanded her father send a private car to take her back to her family home. Connor was actively being held in federal custody without bail, while the financial investigators expanded the scope of his wire fraud charges across state lines. The commercial lenders were aggressively calling in every single revolving debt, completely drowning the Watson estate in an inescapable flood of default notices and aggressive foreclosure threats. "We have lost absolutely everything," my father rasped, leaning forward and resting his trembling hands on the edge of my desk. He looked up at me, attempting to project a fatherly vulnerability that felt incredibly cheap and manufactured. "I know I made terrible misjudgments, but we are still a family. I am asking you to please intervene with your legal contacts. Stop the asset seizures. Call off the bank attorneys. If you just give us a small window to breathe, we can fix this. We can start over. I promise you, everything will be completely different from now on." It was the ultimate, desperate lie of a cornered narcissist. He was only offering a fresh start because he had completely run out of road. He did not regret his actions. He only regretted the catastrophic consequences of getting caught. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed chair, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood of my desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer him a single word of moral reprimand. The time for emotional arguments had expired years ago. I simply looked past his shoulder and gave a brief nod to Caroline Mercer, who was standing quietly near the wall of windows. Caroline walked smoothly to the desk and placed a single, slender black portfolio directly in front of my father. It was not the massive bank dossier from the family dinner. It was significantly thinner, but exponentially more lethal. "You are operating under a massive, fundamental delusion regarding your current leverage," I stated, my tone completely clinical, stripped of any familial emotion. "You honestly believe that your primary problem is Pine and Vale Commercial Bank. You came in here hoping I would use my corporate influence to kindly ask the bank to grant you an extension so you could quietly sell Harbor Row and save your suburban mansion. My father stared at the black portfolio, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Open it, I instructed quietly. His shaking hands fumbled with the cover. He flipped it open to reveal a highly certified, notarized transfer of commercial debt. Pine and Vale Commercial Bank no longer holds the senior lien on the bridge loan you fraudulently secured, I explained, watching his eyes slowly track across the heavy black ink. Commercial banks absolutely despise holding toxic, highly publicized fraudulent debt on their active books. It creates massive regulatory headaches. When the federal raid was executed 2 nights ago, the bank immediately flagged the loan as a total catastrophic loss. They wanted it gone immediately. So, yesterday morning, a private, specialized distressed asset fund stepped in and purchased the entire debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. Douglas looked up, his face a mask of pure confusion. A private fund? Yes, I replied, leaning slightly forward, letting the cold reality settle perfectly over him. A fund wholly owned and exclusively managed by Meridian Ledger Group. I bought your debt. I am the lender now. You cannot sell Harbor Row to save yourself, because you currently owe the entire balance of that fraudulent mortgage directly to me. The twist hit him with devastating, physical force. The final, desperate escape hatch he had been frantically clinging to for the past 48 hours was violently slammed shut and locked from the outside. He had completely delivered his own execution directly into my hands. Before he could even attempt to formulate a response to his sudden financial entrapment, I delivered the absolute final legal blow. Caroline smoothly reached over and turned the page of the portfolio, revealing a highlighted section of a much older, profoundly familiar document. It was the original text of my grandmother Eleanor estate trust. Furthermore, I continued, my voice maintaining a steady, lethal calm, you completely ignored the most critical protective clause grandmother intentionally wrote into her legal directives. It is a strict, irrevocable, no-contest provision. The clause explicitly states that any individual who attempts to forge documents, abuse management authority, or fraudulently steal the designated beneficiary share of the property automatically and permanently forfeits any and all legal standing or claim to the estate. I paused, making sure he absorbed every single word. By arrogantly forging her signature while she was in a hospital bed to secure that bridge loan, you did not simply commit federal wire fraud, I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. You legally severed yourself from the trust. You have absolutely zero authority to sell, manage, or even step foot on the property. You burned your own bridge to the ground. My father slumped backward into the leather chair. Entirely defeated, the patriarchal titan of the family was reduced to a quiet, shaking shell. He looked at me, completely out of options, completely out of lies, waiting for the final execution order. I closed the black portfolio. I did not finish him off right there in the office. A quick, messy ending in private was far too generous for the decades of humiliation they had forced upon me. I am not going to negotiate with you today, I stated, my tone indicating the meeting was entirely over. You will return to your heavily mortgaged house. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. You, Mother, and Paige will attend a formal mediation session in the primary conference room down the hall. We will have a certified note servicing representative present. We will resolve this entire catastrophe permanently. Douglas slowly stood up, looking like a man walking toward a firing squad. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final, pathetic plea, but the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped him dead. Do not bring your apologies tomorrow, I instructed him firmly, my voice echoing slightly in the large office. They have absolutely no value here. Just bring your reading glasses. Tomorrow, we finish this with ink and binding signatures. Tears will not save your house. The primary conference room of my corporate headquarters was a masterpiece of cold, unyielding architecture. It featured a massive slab of frosted glass for a table, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs that offered absolutely no comfort to the guilty. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the final assembly of the Watson family convened. My father, Douglas, sat rigidly at the far end, his face a landscape of defeated gray skin. Beside him sat my mother, Elaine, hiding her swollen, tear-stained eyes behind a pair of oversized, dark designer sunglasses. Paige sat as far away from them as physically possible, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, vibrating with a toxic, impotent rage. Connor was noticeably absent, currently wearing a bright orange uniform in a federal holding facility, while his attorneys desperately tried to negotiate a plea deal for his interstate wire fraud charges. Flanking me on my side of the glass table were Caroline Mercer and a senior note servicing representative dispatched by the distressed asset fund I now controlled. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. There would be no shouting today. There would be no arrogant declarations of patriarchal authority or petty insults about my wardrobe. There was only the clinical, terrifying finality of contract law. I opened the thick, leather-bound settlement binder resting in front of me. I did not look at my parents as a daughter seeking closure. I looked at them entirely as a corporate liquidator assessing a bankrupt entity. I began by establishing the baseline mathematics of their ruin. I presented the official commercial appraisal of the harbor property, which valued the land and the structures at exactly $4,500,000. When I spoke that massive number aloud, I saw my father physically twitch. A sickening, desperate glimmer of hope flashed across his exhausted eyes. He was already doing the frantic mental arithmetic, foolishly convincing himself that even after the debts were cleared, he would walk away with a couple of $1 million. He was already shopping for a smaller, but still respectable, luxury estate in a neighboring gated community to salvage his fragile ego. I let him enjoy that pathetic delusion for exactly 5 seconds before I instructed the servicing representative to read the itemized ledger of deductions. It was a brutal, monotonous execution by numbers. First came the immediate, non-negotiable payoff of the fraudulent commercial bridge loan my father had secured, which instantly erased $1,800,000 right off the top. Then came the severe commercial default penalties, accumulating daily at a punishing 24% interest rate. Next were the aggressive state and federal tax liens triggered by Connor's sudden corporate collapse, followed by the exorbitant legal fees for the massive federal forensic audit they had forced my firm to conduct. Finally, we subtracted the heavy punitive damages explicitly outlined in my grandmother's original legal directives for direct fiduciary fraud. Douglas slammed his hand flat against the glass table, a weak, desperate echo of his former arrogance. He demanded that the property be placed immediately on the open market to solicit a massive bidding war. He aggressively insisted that as the elder of the family, he retained the absolute right to select the commercial real estate broker to maximize their return. I silenced him with a single, freezing look. I reminded him, very slowly and very clearly, of the irrefutable medical records and the forged signature we had discussed in my office the previous afternoon. By committing a severe federal felony to usurp my grandmother's explicit legal directives, he had permanently incinerated his own legal standing. He was not a seller. He was not a manager. He was merely an unsecured liability sitting at my table. Because he had deliberately violated the strict no contest clause, he and my mother had absolutely zero authority to manage, direct, or even express an opinion on the sale of the asset. Paige and Connor were legally irrelevant ghosts in this transaction, possessing absolutely no rights whatsoever. I then revealed the final destination of the property. The exclusive purchaser of the 12 storage bays and the automotive garage was a private historical asset conservation firm entirely funded and controlled by my corporate umbrella. I was legally buying my own inheritance out from under their fraudulent debt, permanently locking it away behind an impenetrable corporate shield. Grandmother's legacy was finally safe. It would never again be used as a cheap speculative tool to fund their suburban vanity projects. Then came the final settlement figure, the absolute bottom line. I slid the final accounting sheet across the frosted glass. After completely settling the massive home equity line of credit my father had secretly taken out, to avoid an immediate federal indictment for residential bank fraud. The remaining liquid capital allocated to my parents was exactly $92,000. Douglas stared at the number printed on the crisp white paper. The sum was completely incomprehensible to a man who used to spend that much money on private country club memberships and imported wine in a single calendar year. $92,000 was not enough to rebuild an empire. It was barely enough to secure a modest, cramped apartment in a working-class suburb and buy groceries for a few years. It was the exact opposite of the glittering, wealthy dream they had used to justify their cruelty toward me. They had traded their entire legacy for a narrow, invisible life. I did not give them time to mourn. I pushed 3 separate legal documents across the table toward them. These were my absolute, non-negotiable conditions for releasing those pathetic remaining funds. The first document was an ironclad, comprehensive waiver legally forcing Douglas, Elaine, Connor, and Paige to permanently surrender any and all future claims against me, my corporations, or the harbor property. The second was a severe permanent cease and desist order, banning them from ever attempting to contact me by phone, by mail, or in person for the rest of their natural lives. The third and final document was a sworn, legally binding acknowledgement stating clearly for the public record that Lillian Watson owed her family absolutely nothing, neither morally nor financially. Elaine broke completely. She buried her face in her hands and let out a series of ugly, gasping sobs that echoed pathetically in the silent room. She cried for her lost garden parties, her stolen social status, and the terrifying reality of her new poverty. Paige simply glared at me, her eyes burning with a toxic, impotent hatred. She had bet her entire superficial life on the golden child, and now she was walking away with absolutely nothing but a ruined reputation. Douglas slowly picked up the heavy silver pen I had provided. His hands shook so violently he could barely grip the metal. The man who had proudly called me a worthless freeloader in his expensive kitchen just days ago was now being forced to sign away his entire existence just to receive the meager, leftover scraps of the very collapse he had orchestrated. He signed his name 3 times. Elaine signed next, her tears staining the paper. Paige signed last, throwing the pen back onto the glass when she was finished. They had absolutely no cards left to play. The meeting adjourned without a single handshake or word of goodbye. We rode the private corporate elevator down to the ground floor in a thick, suffocating silence. The brass doors slid open, revealing the bright, blinding morning sun of the city center. When we stepped out through the revolving glass doors and onto the pristine concrete sidewalk, a vehicle was already idling quietly at the curb. It was the exact same pristine, jet-black BMW from the night of the ruined family dinner, but this time, it was not arriving to deliver a stack of terrifying legal documents. The suited driver stepped out and held the heavy rear door open for me. I walked toward the car, my posture perfectly straight, feeling the warm sun on my face. I slid into the luxurious leather interior. I did not look back. I did not offer a final glance of pity or triumph. As the driver smoothly merged the heavy luxury vehicle into the bustling city traffic, carrying me completely and permanently away from my past, I looked out the tinted window one last time. I saw the Watson family standing awkwardly on the hot pavement, desperately checking their phones to calculate if they could afford a cheap rideshare back to the house they no longer owned. They were left standing on the curb, completely stripped of their stolen money, completely stripped of their fake prestige, and entirely erased from my world. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.